Hey, Mr. Resh here. What we're going to do is cover 13.2. It's titled The North's People. And our goal here to finish chapter 13 is to really start understanding the differences between what was happening in the North and in the South. This stuff would help lead us into civil war as a country in the 1860s. So let's get started. Point number one is going to really focus on the factory system, which we talked about, like people like Lowell Mill, that was created in Massachusetts, would really change and kind of shape the North and their economy. So the first point is, as the factory system developed, conditions actually got worse in the factories. Now, this kind of is odd because usually when things go over time, whether it's you're practicing basketball, things improve. But in this case, it was the opposite. Conditions worsened, and that's partly because of a couple of reasons which we'll explore here. So we'll answer that question in a bit. But in the 1840s, work time was about 11.4 hours a day. So imagine having to work or go to school for 4 more hours a day and having shorter breaks. That was pretty much your day at the time. 2 points to go here with this. These long-houred work days would definitely lead to increased injuries. As you can see in the picture, work quarters were tight. In the summers, the machines put off a lot of heat and it was very hot. And in the winter, despite all the machine heat, it would be very cold. So it wasn't a pleasant place to live or actually work. And you got to keep in mind that the people who ran these factories, their number one goal was profit. Okay? They were so profit driven, and they knew that they could easily replace workers because there were immigrants coming off the boats in the thousands in the 1840s to 1860s. So if somebody didn't like their work, they just said, get out of here, and they picked up the next person who would work for a low wage. This would lead into organizing. By organizing, we're talking about unions. So I might write that word in here, unions. Interesting thing about unions is that typically their job is to fight for better pay, better hours, better working conditions, and stuff like that. In our state of Wisconsin, Scott Walker has eliminated unions pretty much throughout the entire state, and it may have been affecting your parents' incomes and their working conditions. As teachers, our teacher union now is no longer effective in negotiating our salaries. So unions are beneficial to work. We're going to see that here in the next few points, but they also kind of go against the employers, the guys who are hiring, because unions typically fight for higher pay, which would eventually decrease the profits of the owners. But anyways, here's our next point or two about organizing. Trade unions were originally for skilled workers. You might have been a blacksmith and you would have been in a blacksmith unit. You might have been a cooper or a wheelwright or something like that, making wheels. You would all get together and you would say, hey, we're not going to work unless you give us better pay. So that had a little bit of weight and it was successful. Point two, unions originally fought, instead of an 11.4-hour workday, they wanted to fight for a 10-hour workday and higher wages. Okay, point three, the unions could be effective if they use strikes, but you should know that strikes typically were not effective. In most cases, they aren't, and they have not been in the past. Here's a nice little clip. This is actually from the 1920s, but it gets the same point away that what the unions were fighting for was eventually, in the 1920s, it would be 8 hours of work, 8 hours of sleep or rest, and 8 hours of play for whatever you wanted to do. So that's kind of cool, and it drives home the point that unions did work out and look out for the worker. A strike such as this is actually the Haymarket riot. I don't remember the year, but in the background you see a bomb being set off. You see the what might have been called the Pinkertons or the police putting down the rioters right here. Um, most strikes typically are not violent, as you saw in that picture. The point is to drive home the message that, hey, a lot of people want better lives and better wages and such. All right, when we talk about unions, though, we need to talk about who they excluded or did not include, and that was definitely women and also African Americans at the time. They faced prejudice and discrimination constantly on the workplace. Um, Men, sadly, did not want to compete with women and African Americans. So the men who got paid the most typically were all for unions, but they did not include women. We need to understand that both these groups were paid less than males and they were not allowed to join unions. That is the point there. Moving on to the last page here. Cities would rise in growth and in size during this time. For example, New York City, for example, would grow immensely. They would have about 800,000 people. Okay, 800K is what I'm putting in here. 800,000 people by 1860, and Philadelphia would have 500,000 people. So it wasn't until really the 1840s, 1860s that we see cities of about 1 million people in the United States. Okay? And one of the points that we're going to have to make eventually is, why did these cities become so big? All right? But point A, as cities' populations increased, cities around the entire U.S. start to grow as well. This is especially for the North because this is where immigrants went in search of jobs. And today, the same thing happens when the car businesses, Ford and Chevy, started to decrease in their sales in 2009. Ford in Detroit laid off a ton of people. Janesville, Wisconsin, GM factory laid off a ton of people. And where'd these people go for work? They moved to the big city like Milwaukee and Chicago because there's needs for services and for employment there. So that's where they moved, to the cities. Detroit, on the one hand, was one city that actually lost their population. All right, so we need to talk about the immigration boom now. For 20 years, from 1840 to 1860, there was a huge influx of Irish. Now, in 1846, the potato famine happened due to a potato disease, and this caused starvation. All right, people really, oopsie, there we go. People started losing their crops and they were starving. So this is a very famous statue of Irish, I believe it's in New York, literally coming off starving with nothing on their backs or as possessions, to make a better life for themselves. Okay. In this migration from Ireland, 1.5 million people came to the United States, like I said, because of that potato disease and the food shortage. My grandparents and their relatives, they came over because of the potato famine. Yours may have as well. Okay, I should have popped down this picture earlier just to give you an idea. This is a picture of New York City around 1860. So cities were rising in size and in population because partly of the Irish and other immigration. So how did immigration impact our country? Well, new cultures, new languages, new religions would be springing up in our country. For example, the Irish were mainly Roman Catholics, so they brought Catholicism into our country in large numbers. Certain customs came with those immigrants to the United States. We could talk about Easter eggs. We could talk about, Halloween, all those things that were pagan type practices that came over from Ireland. And we talked about St. Patrick's Day celebrations. That's a big Irish thing. So all those little cool holidays that we see and we celebrate, whether it's tossing beads, drinking green beer, lighting off fireworks, a lot of that stuff comes from immigrants, and it is quite cool to be participating in that. And we have the immigrants to thank for it. Now, finally, in these large cities, there would be immense amounts of prejudice. Now, prejudice is basically unfair treatment or discrimination towards a group of people. Point number one, why did this happen? Americans feared the change. They were, I mean, me, myself, I'm deathly afraid of change once in a while too. But these Americans did not like the cultural change that was brought into the country, and they also were afraid of losing their jobs. Okay? This sign helps us kind of understand, in a way, why prejudice, what types of prejudice were happening. And it says, help wanted, no Irish need apply. So this employer clearly would not be hiring any Irish immigrants and did not like them. Here's a term for you, big one. Make sure you write this down, nativists. Nativism is opposition to immigration. Basically, these were American-born citizens who had lived in the country for their entire lives. And they said and felt that immigrants brought crime and disease to the country and took away jobs. That is nativism. A nativist is one who believes that. Now, nativism was so strong that there was actually a political party formed known as the Know Nothing Party, and I believe they were once called the American Party as well. I'll check on that, but you need to know them as the Know Nothing Party. And the cool story about this is that they actually attacked immigrants, literally as they came off the boat. And when police and law enforcement would come and ask them, hey, do you know about so-and-so's beating and mistreatment? And they would say, hey, I know nothing. So that's how they got their name. They were known as the Know Nothing Party, basically the party of nativists that sometimes physically attacked immigrants. And one of the things that they did was they created stricter immigration laws in terms of how long you had to wait to become a citizen. They were successful in bumping it to 21 years from 5-year wait. That is 13.2. Catch you later.